Hey everybody, I'm Bryan Grossman, Editor-in-Chief here at 6035 Magazine. This is the 6035, the weekly show that recaps all you need to know in the news. Our guests in studio today, Senior Reporter Pam Zubeck and Managing Editor Helen Lewis. And we are talking about the very first feature in 6035 Magazine. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
Yeah. And before we even do that, Happy New Year.
Same to you.
Yeah, this is the very first podcast of the new year, and with our new name, the 6035. So pretty exciting. Let's get into it because this is a big story. Pam Zubeck covered what we're calling the deadliest year. This is 2022, and just the spike in traffic fatalities, and I think pedestrian fatalities too. Is that right?
No, not pedestrian.
Just the traffic fatalities. Okay. What did we learn about 2022?
Well, it was dangerous out there.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to say other than, it's a lot of careless driving, a lot of speeding, some impaired driving.
Mm-hmm.
The impaired driving is hard to get a handle on in a timely way because there's so much depends on toxicology that's late coming in. But yeah, it was really dangerous, and there were even people killed that were doing nothing wrong. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mm-hmm. What kind of numbers are we looking at? How bad was it? 56
people died, ranging in age from 6 years old to their 90s.
Mm-hmm.
These crashes happen all times of day, every day of the week. There are certain days that are more safe than others. I think the least safe is a Monday.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I read that, yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that I found really interesting is of these 56, one happened in the month of February, which, intuitively you'd think, that's when roads are bad. That's when it could be really risky. But I don't know, maybe people account for that, and so they're more careful. I don't know. So that's what we found out, and it's not unique to here. It's happening statewide, and it's happening nationwide.
Yeah, and there were some bigger issues that law enforcement pointed to. I know when you and I first talked about this story, before you'd even written it, we talked about like the impact of COVID on the way people were driving, and you found, at least with the police, that there was an impact there, right?
Yeah, there's been other agencies that have sort of studied this and determined that when, in the COVID year, 2020, that there wasn't as much traffic, and so people felt like they owned the road more, and then when people started driving again, they continued those habits.
Driving fast,
right.
Going through stop signs.
And Lieutenant Steve Noblet, who heads up the traffic enforcement section for the Colorado Springs Police Department, said even that he thinks that the tension that people were feeling during 2021 contributed in a way that, they were angry, maybe they had lost their job, maybe they were worried about making rent. They're just, a lot going on with them to make them more, filled with rage, and so that contributes, Somebody cuts you off in traffic, it might be totally unintentional, but
right.
Yeah. So.
People got a little madder more recently than they used to. And I think you see that even beyond the road. I mean, you hear stories everywhere of just people not being as sociable as they used to.
And that's what Councilman Dave Donaldson observed. He's ridden with the cops. And so I talked with him, and he said that was the thing that really surprised him was the lack of courtesy for one another out there. And the biggest single other than speed seems to be the common denominator in most of these. But and I'm not talking about 5 miles over the speed limit, but in one case they clocked somebody at 117 in a residential area.
Holy
believe it or not. But the distraction of phones is also a huge deal. And Lieutenant Noblet told the anecdote of he was on a fatal crash scene at night investigating. They had set up traffic cones to narrow the street so that they could have room to do their investigation. So here they were. They had traffic one lane each way. So they just, for 5 minutes, the officers on scene counted, and more than half of the people who drove through were doing something with their phone. And through a crash site.
They were probably looking to see what was happening on the news. They were at 6035media.org looking for news.
Yeah, I mean,
I was really surprised at how low the fines are for using your phone. I looked it up before we came in here, and I think it's $300 for texting or using the internet while you're driving. And if you injure someone or there's a fatality related to it, it goes up to $1,000 fine and up to a year in prison.
Yeah.
But that $300 doesn't seem like...
Well, here's the thing. It's virtually impossible to enforce.
I saw that
because
they said that, yeah.
It's not a primary...
you can't be pulled over just for...
Correct.
Right.
It has to be in combination with something else.
Some other infraction.
And then how do you prove it?
Right, because I could be making a phone call, which doesn't mean I'm texting
Or you could be looking at your GPS, am I going to turn the next corner or
So
something?
a couple of states have introduced you can't touch your phone at all.
Right.
Oregon and Washington, and they saw a big drop in use. I'm not sure how they're enforcing it. In Australia, they enforce it with cameras.
So for those
but I know that wouldn't fly here.
Is it that they can't touch their phone, or that they
cannot,
that they have to be hands-free?
They can't even touch it to accept a route on their...
You can't touch it.
Don't touch it.
Can't touch this.
Yeah. And apparently that's been very effective in Oregon and Washington, but not California. I don't know why the difference would be.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think the cops here are a little frustrated by that inability to
enforce that.
Well, it sounds like they don't have enough people to enforce it, even if they were more.
That's another issue. I mean, they're short, 8 officers. They've got to compete with the patrol division, which of course is short by 70 or something. So everyone wants to have a police officer respond if you have somebody trying to break into your house. So, they're not going to, the motor unit, what they call the motor unit with these motorcycles, that's the traffic enforcement mechanism that the police department uses. So you don't, you'd rather have that new officer on the patrol, right? So they're down people. But the county coroner, or Dr. Leon Kelly, who is a tremendous researcher in terms of he always looks at the data. He always wants to do that. And so he did it for us. And he said that by looking back at all the reasoning, now he was looking at 2021 numbers because it was the only full year. He said most of these are strictly dumb mistakes, and so would enforcement have changed that? Probably not.
Right.
Although he did allow that perhaps a beefed up DUI enforcement could maybe have an impact eventually or something. But so people do dumb things. So the police department, they do directed enforcement with other agencies. They all get together, the State Patrol,
Sheriff's Office,
El Paso County, right, and they'll do a directed enforcement, say along I-25 or something.
Usually corresponding with like a holiday.
Yeah, sometimes.
The heat is on thing.
Right. And but get this. So I rode with an officer, and he.
Yeah, you did a ride along for this story, right?
Yeah, in an SUV, not a motorcycle.
No.
Thank you very much. But
not a sidecar.
But he said that even with when they do direct enforcement, the overhead directional signs, they will announce
the heat is on.
That we have a traffic enforcement operation underway.
Right.
And people still whiz by.
Well, that's because they're drunk and they don't know.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, it's...
You don't read signs when you're wasted and driving.
And when I was with this officer, Officer Alan Roman, every place we went, and we went maybe 6 places, he did not try to hide himself. He didn't, you know how the infamous, motorcycle cop hiding
on
behind
TV,
a tree,
behind the billboard.
But not at all. I mean, he parked right on the street and just waited. And
people still.
It was just within a few minutes. Bingo, bingo, bingo. You know. Yeah.
I'm kind of amazed by the things I see people do around cops that are driving in traffic.
Oh, right.
And they'll speed
Cut
right
off
up and cut off a cop.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But it happens all the time. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah. And you commute quite a bit, right? You live a fair ways up north, not the North Pole like me, but
not the North Pole like you.
But yeah, it's scary out there. I'm on the interstate every day. I'm driving to work and not working from home. And one of the things I've even done is I will leave the office earlier now and finish working from home because it'll add at least 15, if not double my commute time if I drive out into rush hour. 5:36. But the way people are driving, I just don't want to be around people. So.
I feel like that people have this idea that if they're in, we've had huge safety advances in all of the vehicles. Even the older ones now are so much better than what we grew up with. But I think people feel invincible and they imagine that anything can save them. Yeah. And once you see a wreck on the side of the road, you really realize absolutely not. Like the top half of it's gone. There's nothing that's going to...
Well, here's a common scenario that... has been this past year was seen several times, where a car will be in the left turn bay with traffic coming onto them, and they will see the traffic coming. They will expect the traffic to be moving at the normal pace based on years of driving. So they'll go ahead and make their left turn. But then this car is coming. It's barreling at them a lot faster, and so it's smack, you know. And then also another thing that's happened. I don't think it's super common, but where two cars will get together, and then the impact is so great that it shoves into another lane of traffic.
Sure, and hits another vehicle.
Right, that was just minding their business, doing nothing wrong.
And that's a good point and I have a 10-year-old son, and so he's, and I know you have a 16-year-old daughter who just started driving. So thinking about when I'm driving, things that I want to relay to him, just because you're in this lane and there are people acting up in this lane doesn't mean that that's not going to become your problem, right? So if an accident happens in the passing lane or the merging lane and you're in the middle lane, that doesn't mean they're not going to end up in your lane. So,
and Lieutenant Noble said that, of course, what can they do other than preach? So he does like to preach, and that's a good thing. But he says drivers need to, first of all, put the phone down. Just put it down. And be aware.
Be present.
Expand your awareness to all sides of you. The right, the left, the rear, the front. Be aware.
Sure.
And so, because people aren't, they're like staring straight ahead. They're not paying any.
And to my point, being aware is also thinking ahead. I see brake lights ahead. That probably means I should start slowing down soon. Or, this person over here in this lane is not driving like they should be. Let's give them some space.
Correct. Right. Boy, that's what I do. That's for sure.
Let them pass. Let them get way ahead of you. I like driving when there's nobody around me. And it's a pleasant experience. But
one thing that we did ask the police department about is that there was a survey that was done by the RAND Corporation of officers who said that they did not feel like they were well trained in making traffic stops and such like that. And so we asked about that, and Lieutenant Noblet actually acknowledged that they probably do need to do more refresher on that. They are trained. I guess some departments don't even train them very well, but our officers are trained. After they graduate the academy, they have to ride with another officer for like 3 or 4 months before they are on their own. And so they have to go through all that. They tell them, make a traffic stop. How do you do that? And here's an interesting thing. These officers who get you on radar, they have you in their head before they have you on radar. That's how well trained they are. They're trained.
What does that mean?
They judge your speed
by looking at you.
Yeah.
Correct.
Before they get the actual evidence.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the radar just
Confirms, supports.
correct.
Yeah.
So
So they're not out there zapping everybody. They know what to look for.
Right.
And yeah.
Yep, they can gauge, especially some of these motorcycle officers that have been at it for 20 years.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You know, they really, and the other thing is they have a laser, not just radar, but they can use a laser that is super accurate.
Okay.
You know, and so yeah, I thought that was interesting that they know before they put the radar on you that you're,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we got to wrap up here in a minute, but let's do this. We'll go around the table. When was your last moving violation? This is to Helen.
I was 18.
Oh, wow.
I was driving to uni and I was alongside a semi-trailer and I got anxious. And instead of using my head and thinking I'll slow down and let him get ahead, I was like, I'll just get in front of him. I think I was 5 or 6 kilometers over the speed limit.
Which is like 80 miles an hour over.
And do you know what? I did.
If my math is correct.
So a couple of miles over, but
That's
actually, I didn't get a ticket for that. The guy said, "Are you in a hurry?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "Do you feel unwell?" And I didn't realize he was trying to give me out. So I was like,
Right. Yeah,
"No."
that's it. B.
And he said, "What were you doing?" And I told him the truth. And he's like, he put his book shut and he's like, "Call me Father Christmas." And I got back in my car and left. So I haven't actually had one. But yeah, I should have.
You've never had one? So
No.
okay.
No, I haven't.
All right. Pam?
I've only had 2 in my life.
Yeah.
So
When was the last one?
it probably was about 8 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I was
That's
going
pretty
to
recent.
I was going to see my parents in western Kansas.
Oh, you're allowed to speed through
It
Kansas.
was like the wide open spaces, you know, blah blah blah, and then
Yeah.
of course come over Rise and meet.
Smoky.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know those troopers, they get you, man.
Well,
And
they're so bored out there.
it was like, oh my goodness, you know, it was a pretty expensive
Yeah?
ticket. Yeah.
That's a bummer. If you can't speed through Kansas, where can you
Where
speed?
can you
through?
speed?
Wyoming has a few spots where it's 85, I think, which means, you know, you can push it a little.
In South Dakota, it's 90 on the interstate.
Really?
I
We were just
think.
up there a few years ago. I didn't see that one, but yeah, so.
Yeah. What about you? You don't get
Oh, man, I was just about to wrap it up.
No.
I don't know when I remember I got pulled over at the academy once in high school.
Oh.
We had a soccer game, and after the soccer game, I was driving 3 of my friends back to wherever their car was, and so wasn't really paying attention. And I know I wasn't going. It was maybe 4 miles over the limit in the base housing area near Air Academy High School, and I got pulled over, and they gave me a ticket. And the academy, or I guess any military federal place, it's different because they can charge you money, but you don't lose points.
Right.
Is that right? It was one or the other.
Yeah,
that's
but they
it.
also enforce it much more.
Really
like if
strict.
you're 1 mile over.
Yeah, like the fact that I was 4 miles over the limit was kind of silly. I know I've been pulled over more than once since then, but I think like Helen, I flirted my way out of it. So I know I did come to a complete stop once in Inglewood up in Denver and was pulled over, and I didn't have I had just gotten new proof of registration that was on its way. So instead of charging me for the moving violation, which would have been like 3 points or 2 points, they charged me for not having proof of registration, which I only then had to take to City Hall, whatever it was, you know. And
so it
say,
cleared up?
Yeah, and they said okay, so they dropped the charge. So I remember there were a couple times I got pretty lucky, but yeah. Anyway.
Okay, so before we wrap up, you know, we've been making light of this, and this is not a comical thing. This is not a joke. And to quote Lieutenant Noblet, we have an epidemic on our roads where people are dying at an alarming rate. And if you think that 56 people, they're not at the dinner table this year. They're gone. These people represent family members, you know, cherished friends, and that sort of thing. So to quote Lieutenant Noblet, I will say, put the phone down, drive the speed limit.
And don't have the extra drink.
Yeah, think about that too. And that's a whole nother story and discussion we could get into, especially with marijuana now, and how do you know if somebody is impaired versus. So yeah, lots of stuff. Pam, really great story, and
amazing story.
I'm super happy to have it as our very first cover for 6035 magazine. I think that's awesome. Also, thank you to Helen Lewis for joining me in the studio. Don't forget to pick up the very first issue of 6035 magazine, available January 11th on newsstands. And it'll be arriving in homes through our new mailing system starting January 12th. Check out the website at 6035media.org once that's live. The show is produced by Dave Gardner and Nick Raven. Videocast is directed by Nick Raven. Music is by Jeremiah Walter. Our digital media specialist is Sean Cassidy. Art director is Dustin Glatz. Publisher is Amy Gillentine. And I'm Bryan Grossman, editor-in-chief. We'll see you next time on the 6035.
The 6035.